Welcome back, and thank you for joining me on another exploration of the Columbian Exposition of 1893. This episode will be primarily focused on the construction of various buildings for this event. In the previous episode, we reviewed the initial groundwork documentation, or lack thereof in many cases, showing inconsistencies within the images along with adding sources from various documents, and including text sections from this book surrounding the event. This presentation will contain very much the same process and include some additional lines of research. So let's begin. We start with an image that is labeled Beach at Jackson Park, World's Fair site. No medium stated on this image, however, it appears to be a photograph. This image is representing the shoreline running along Jackson Park, and we see that it is quite a busy location. The main detail of this image that struck me is this shoreline that appears to be made almost entirely out of stone or brickwork. It is labeled a beach, and maybe these stones do not extend the entirety of the coastline in the image, yet what exactly are we looking at here? So there are many questions that arise, and this would be the best opportunity to ask the community, those watching, what would be the purpose of this bricked shoreline? Is this beautification? Simply cosmetic? Was it more for utility? Maybe as a type of breakwater? Was this an artificial shoreline? And if so, would this be the best method to do so? Why use stone or brick rather than a more organic material? Was this done for the fair? If you have any experience in masonry, bricklaying, engineering, city planning, etc., would this be common for the time period? Additionally, do we have any historical references to the building of this shoreline? The brickwork does appear to be old, however that could be the result of this area being located along a lake, which would be under constant bombardment of wind and water. There are even indications in this image of water crashing onto the artificial shoreline. With time, water can erode even the toughest substances. One of life's little lessons, I feel, and that is persistence prevails. I simply do not know, and I'm looking for more data points. If you have any insights, leave them in the comments so they can be reviewed and discussed. There are some indications in this document as to the work being completed in and around the shoreline. This section coming from the general plans for the exposition, which is contained within this publication. I'll begin with this disclaimer of sorts that is presented in the first paragraph of this plan. These plans have been prepared without accurate data upon basis in many respects hypothetical. They have been intended simply to aid in debate by giving a more definite form to verbal suggestions. Essentially, this is the plan, but not really the plan. This is the written equivalent to brainstorming or ideation. This is dated November 21st, 1890, and wanted to include it so we can start to understand the chronology of this event and how utterly compressed it is becoming, or was, rather. Recall that in our last video, that moving of Earth began in February of the following year, of 1891, 3 months later. The following section labeled The Grounds discusses the shaping, building, and beautification of various water areas within this event. Take note of the materials being mentioned. It reads as follows. The borders of the canal and the basin in the court are to be treated formally with embankments of stone or brick, surmounted by parapets or balustrades of stone, iron, brick, or terracotta, and opening upon steps and landings here and there where boating parties may land. All walks and outdoor places for assemblages of people are to be furnished with numerous seats and resting places, and are to be paved with mosaics of brick, stone, or concrete blocks, except where gravel or stone chips may seem more expedient. At their own expense, the South Park commissioners will pave the beach along the entire shore of the lake. Now, an important thing here, this is my own ignorance, let's say, I did not know what a parapet was. And a parapet, the definition is as follows: a defensive wall or elevation as of earth or stone in a fortification. And the second one here reads as follows: an elevation raised above the main wall or rampart of a permanent fortification. Now, in my initial research, many of the points being made about this event was that these were temporary buildings. Basically, this entire exposition was made out to be temporary, with very few exceptions. Yet here we have an indication that the borders of the canal that snaked through this exposition along with the central basin were to be formally treated with stone, iron, brick, or terracotta. All walks and outdoor places where people will be assembled are to be paved with mosaics of brick, stone, or concrete blocks. And finally, the beach will be paved. Is that possibly what is represented here in this image? That is unknown. Additionally, we have mention of more formally treated materials in regards to construction in these initial plans. This will be useful information as we continue this story, and it reads as follows. This group of buildings, namely the administration, the machinery, the manufacturers, the mining, and the electric, are to form a whole in design. They are intended as a mass to be impressive, as a plan most convenient, and as structures to be very substantial. The materials entering into their composition will be largely iron and masonry of brick and stone, though a free use will be made of terracotta, wood stuff, and other materials. So again, we have mentioned in the initial plans that the most notable buildings at this event were expected to be impressive as structures go, very substantial, using durable materials such as iron, masonry of brick, and stone. It seems unusual that the document does not really indicate any sense of expediency to merit these temporary materials over formally treated materials, stating that it would be ideal to use durable materials, but this event's grand opening is looming and the materials must be adjusted to fit the constrained timeline. So let's continue on. This information will most likely be referenced later on or in future presentations, and wanted to include it here as additional data points of the initial construction process. However, I would like to present a scenario regarding what we just read. We discussed earlier this disclaimer, let's call it, that these plans were prepared without accurate data and practically hypothetical. When beginning a new project, especially one of this magnitude, there would be an almost unfathomable excitement around it. Simply imagining what it could become, how it could be presented to the world. In the initial stages, the ideation process is usually quite dynamic and flexible and imaginative, as you develop many variations of how it could be completed or accomplished. In some cases, the initial ideas bleed through the entire process and become a truly creative expression of a project. Usually, however, the end result is a shade of the ideation and original direction, due to any number of circumstances, being budget, timeline, logistics, talent, location, etc. Could this simply be what happened here? the wild imaginative ideas of the grandeur and opulence this exposition could be, it is something to consider along with the spectrum of theories that surround this event. Either way, it seems from the inception, the plan was to build these waterways and notable buildings out of lasting materials. So with that thought in mind, maybe there were indications or evidence of this shoreline that could still be found on Google Earth today. So I began referencing old maps of the fair to try and triangulate where exactly this image was taken. The first spot chosen was to begin at the shoreline along the fairgrounds, which is where I thought this older image may have been taken. I didn't find much, yet I dropped the yellow man down on this spot here, on this pier, to get a vantage point of the shoreline and initially check the water, and found this stone. Now, this is a shoreline of a major city, and it will certainly contain any number of treasures, let's say. I'm not saying this is a brick, or even a potential artifact from our image. However, it was enough to pique my interest and indulge in some more exploration. So we were looking for a crescent-shaped shoreline as seen in our image, and so I ventured northward from the previous location and started popping down to various spots to get a visual on the shoreline. What we see here is how the Chicago shoreline in many places has what appears to be a breakwater or an artificial step that is completed with what seems to be large stone blocks. Quite large, indeed. Upon closer inspection, some of them have these strange grooves along the edges. Initially thinking maybe these grooves were to reduce the wake of waves. However, upon closer inspection, there didn't seem to be any consistency with where they were placed. Some blocks had them on the front facing the water, some had them on the sides, some had none, and some had them on all sides. This was not the main objective, and even though I found these very interesting, I continued northward. We see that these blocks continue and at one point are preceded with what looks like a newer construction or breakwater in front. As I continued north, moving closer to the downtown core, there were more indications of artificial shorelines, which seemed more modern. At this point, it was time to circle back and look for more clues because this was too far from the fairgrounds to be included in this publication. Finding the large stone blocks along the shoreline was curious to me, and it could very well have a logical and documented backstory as to why it is there and how it was built. Maybe someone could explore that further and let us know in the comments. From here, it was back to the books. Searching through the pages and photos online and in my archives of anything that could benefit this tangent that had a firm grip on my attention. Flipping through a book called Official Views of the World's Columbian Exposition, the next clue made itself apparent. This image labeled as on the beach east of the manufacturers building. It was also a perspective from the opposite direction, looking northward instead of south in our initial image. From here, the various maps of the grounds came into play. Using one called the Union News Company indexed map of the World's Columbian Exposition, it was overlaid on the fairgrounds on Google Earth, and now the beach in question has become quite apparent. Additionally, we have on the map an indication of a small pier with a symbol of a boat that says Navy on it, which would line up well with this second image, basically looking directly at the battleships docked for showcase. Searching on the northern end of the shoreline where the first image was taken provided little answers. However, moving southbound and almost to the other end of this beach, there was this rough section of earth, and after descending to ground level, there it is. Here is the original brick shoreline that was presented in these photos, still very much intact, and we can now see that it was a mixture of colors and tones, different sizes and shapes. This to me was brilliant and such a hit of discovery. that in all honesty could mean absolutely nothing in the grand scheme of this fair. So what was the purpose of this wild tangent of research and exploration? As an artist in many fields, you will have a portfolio of your work that is presented in interviews and is your artistic representation of your experience, a repertoire of your talent and ability. This channel is becoming a portfolio, as with many creators on this platform, to present various data points and expression of perspectives. Maybe 20 videos down the line, this information may become valuable and relevant. Maybe it will fade into obscurity as a useless segment in an early video. Either way, hopefully you enjoyed this little storyline and found it as interesting as I did. Our next image is called Women's Building in Course of Erection, October 1891. Alright, let's review this one. First thing to take note of is this signature on the bottom right, as it will be frequent throughout the following images. I think it's O.M. Morris & Co. Photos, but it is incredibly sloppy. We also have another signature on the bottom left which states J. Mans and something. I can't quite make out what the second name is in all honesty. We have an indication that this is indeed a photograph. Let's go over our first detail, and this is a big one. Let's pull up our last image of the previous video for reference. This is the administration building construction photo. And now placing these side by side, with the captions included. Both of these photos were taken in October of 1891. Same month, same year. One photo has snow everywhere. The other does not, and in fact has trees with leaves on them. Maybe there was a freak snowstorm. Suppose this is always possible. Even if we venture into the realm of thinking these dates may be altered, what would be the purpose of that? Is this simply a mistake? I'll leave that one with you to ponder. Maybe someone could look up the history of weather conditions for Chicago in 1891, in October specifically, to see if there are any discrepancies with this imagery. Let me know what your thoughts are. Let's check into some information regarding this building for some more context while you browse this photo and a few others for any inconsistencies. In this publication on page 53, we have a section labeled Construction Department, World's Columbian Exposition, and it presents an advertisement. Let's pull out some details of this initial paragraph, starting with a title. Competition in designing the women's building. So initially this is a competition, which seems to be a common thread in building and construction of the time period. Moving on, we read, none but those made by women will be considered. Applicants must be in the profession of architecture, or have had special training therein, and each must state her experience in writing to the chief of construction. We have specifications regarding type of ink, scale, restrictions of certain elements such as brushwork, shade lines, or even landscape elements. We have certain perspectives that must be presented along with dimensions. There is an allowance of certain materials such as staff, stucco, wood, iron, and equivalents. However, we must keep the ornamentation in check so as not to render the building too costly. Sorry, ladies. Good news, though, as this building provided all possible wants of women, including having in view a Bureau of Information with interpreters and guides for strangers, parlors and balconies where ladies may sit and chat. Hopefully there were bonbons to go along with the chatting. There is even an exhibitor's club room and a model kitchen where demonstration lessons may be given. We hope without charge. Well, my goodness, I certainly hope so. What blasphemy. And I certainly hope the sarcasm is palpable. We must remember these documents are products of the time period. Now, one sentence that I found incredibly interesting is this one referencing the longevity of this building. It will undoubtedly be kept as a permanent memorial to women's work after the fair is over, and in it all women's organizations and conventions will find a home. Well, was it kept? I think we all know the answer to that question, unfortunately. The final detail I want to point out was actually one of the first pieces of information in this advertisement, and that is that all submissions need to be completed and sent in by March 23rd, 1891. This document is submitted, and then from March to October is roughly 7 months. I'm referencing October because that is what this image is supposedly depicting. Does this timeline make sense? To receive the submissions, to choose the submissions, then have the winner of the competition finalize the remaining details and work alongside the correct construction channels, surveying where this building will go, breaking ground, foundational and engineering work, plumbing and electrical installed, then building to this point in this image. Personally, I'm skeptical, but that is another one for you to decide. Any professional in these particular fields, chime in with your experience below. Is this reasonable? Does this resemble a progress that is consistent with the timeline given? Speaking of tight timelines, it is very curious how the only people visible in this image are the man and woman who seem to be posing in front of this construction site. There is literally not one soul that I can visibly see in this image besides those two. That in itself is bizarre. One final point before moving on. Considering we are talking about the women's building, it would seem obvious to reference a book from our introduction exploration called Art and Handicraft in the Women's Building of the World's Columbian Exposition, Chicago. Here's an image of what the completed building looked like, and we can reference back and forth from our construction image to the final product. This specific book is roughly 320 pages, and it does not contain one interior photograph of this building. This is an important point here, guys, in terms of general documentation. This publication, dedicated to the assets inside the women's building, does not have one single interior shot showing those assets in context within the building. Not even a closer photograph of the building than this one here. No images of the beautiful rooftop gardens. No images of the grand entryway, of the various galleries. Not even one of the aforementioned chit-chat area. Disappointing, I know. No additional construction photos either. It is becoming harder to understand what would prevent this simple documentation from happening. The link is below should you find the curiosity to investigate for yourself. Let's continue on to our next image. This one is labeled Electrical Building in Course of Erection, November 1891. Again, we have the indication that this is a photo from O.M. Morris & Co. Now, this is an excellent image because it has a glaring inconsistency, and that will then be used to illustrate an example. See if you can spot it while we go through some foundational information. The inconsistency revolves around contrast. Contrast is one of the main indicators of inconsistencies in this historical imagery, in my opinion. It is considered a major principle in art, some even claiming it to be the golden rule of artistic expression or creation. The melding of elements in juxtaposition that alone may wildly differ, yet when combined they create a balanced whole. creating intensity and meaning even. It can also be a guide. I incorporate this into my work specifically to steer the viewer through a design, whether it's a publication, a poster for an event, or a personal piece. Contrasting elements or effects have the ability to subconsciously guide someone's gaze through your work, and is an aspect of design I truly love. It can be used to add interest, create depth, or highlight certain elements of a particular image. Contrast can also be achieved by using different tones of color. We won't delve too much into color theory here, but to simplify the term tone or tones of color, it is the lightness or darkness of a color. This is the main player in these explorations because the imagery is usually black and white. There are some other values that represent colors other than that, like sepia or a sepia tone, for example. It is a tone that was traditionally added to a black and white photograph in the darkroom to warm up the tones. It is that warm reddish-brown color that is often in older imagery, or a filter that is applied to modern imagery which can give it an older appearance. Keep the idea of filters in the back of your mind while viewing these images too. It will certainly be another topic in future videos. Alright, let's begin. The inconsistency in this image is primarily the metal framing on the right side of the image. As we zoom in, I want you to look closely and compare the difference of color between the sky and the areas in between the framing. Take notice how the areas in between the metal framing are darker than the surrounding sky. So do we have an explanation for this? There are instances where color can cause trickery. I'm sure many of you have seen illusions or maybe tests for color blindness, showing similar colored squares or circles or elements that are surrounded by different colors or the same color, yet the shape appears to be a different tone or different colors entirely depending on their surrounding environment. So, is this a trick of the eye, where the proximity of the framing is fooling your perception to visually believe that there's a darker tone in between? This is always a possibility. However, in my opinion, this is not an illusion. This is a remnant of masking and editing of imagery. Here is the reasoning. If we were tasked with tackling this image today, to do something simple like removing the skyline and all intricate spots in between the scaffolding, framing, and buildings, it would merely be time-consuming. Annoying, maybe, but mainly time-consuming. Potentially accomplished with using the magic wand tool in Photoshop, simply selecting sections and deleting them. Additionally, going back and erasing the finer pixels to create a realistic edit. The best part? You can undo mistakes with the press of a button. Or maybe all of that can be done by AI now. However, doing this in the late 19th century would require this to be accomplished by hand with a retouching knife. Striving for perfection in artistic endeavors is a goal for many. This task, however, would almost be impossible. This would be increasing the odds of error to a point of no return. One slip of the knife and the framing is sliced off, or the scaffolding crumbles, or the building loses a wall. This would require surgical precision, and even that is an understatement. So as you have been looking at this image and pondering these comments, did you notice that the metal framing on the left also has a similar treatment? There's indications that the coloring isn't as dark, but it is still different from the surrounding sky. This is such a curious set of anomalies. Digging further, we even have what appear to be fuzzy or blurry areas in some sections. while others that are right beside them are clear. This does not seem to be a product of distance either, as it is occurring on the same structure. When images have anomalies, I'll sometimes bring them into Lightroom to play around with contrast settings to root out any other inconsistencies or investigate potential edits. There is no magic here. I'm merely adjusting the contrasting elements of this image and then rotating through different levels of exposures. If only I could yell "enhance it" at someone furiously smashing their keyboard as the image on the large screen becomes clearer and clearer. Unfortunately, I don't have Hollywood's budget, or secrets, for that matter. This example is a recording of me sliding the exposure setting to view this image. Starting off, the image is quite dark, and as it becomes brighter, stopping here roughly in the middle or regular exposure, there is clearly a difference in color between the framing in question. Isn't this interesting? I would ask you to take note of the metal framing on the left and the blurring taking place here. The tone of the spaces on the left framing isn't as crisp as the framing on the right, yet it is still discolored. We will jump back to that momentarily. As the exposure becomes lighter, we begin to see this strange anomaly within the framing. Look at the jarring contrasting elements here as the framing is so incredibly dark compared to the sky. This appears to indicate retouching, or the lack of retouching within the framed sections. However, this is of course up for you to decide. As you ponder, let me put forth another skeptical line of thinking. The framing on the left, letting the image linger with this current exposure, consider how sections within the framing do appear to be similar to the sky. Some areas are darker, and is that simply due to the cloud cover behind the structures, or artifacts during the photographic process? Well, let's look at the triangular spaces on the very far left of the structure. They look clear or quite transparent compared to our structure on the right. Now, look at the triangular elements on the far right of this structure, and there is quite a difference in the contrast of the spaces in between. This one almost representing identical characteristics as the metal framing on the right structure. So here is a potential theory. The blurring in this image, specifically on the left structure, is intentional. It is intentional because it is blending the hard edges of those triangular sections being removed by an etching knife. Look carefully at some sections where the beams appear thicker than others, which I don't believe is related to perspective, but more to inconsistent knife work. There are even sections beside each other that appear to have been etched out, while the triangular spaces adjacent are still intact. This sporadic blurring is an attempt to cover another attempt to slice out these sections. Some are quite well done. Ultimately, the endeavor was abandoned and blurring was implemented to cover up the tracks. Is that what happened here? That is unknown, and is of course up for you to decipher. From here, using that brief chat into contrast, we will explore another image from a different book called The Photographic World's Fair and Midway Plaisance. As is becoming a common theme within these presentations, let's review the preface or introduction of this book. It reads as follows. A number of more or less credible publications giving views of the World's Columbian Exposition were issued during the fair or soon after its close, but it was impossible that these should be complete or in a style worthy the great subject. Time was required for a compilation of all that was best into a comprehensive whole, which should be the great fair reproduced, and which should be also of the highest artistic finish. Such a work has been accomplished in the Photographic World's Fair and Midway Plaisance. In compact form, but with nothing sacrificed, the pictured story of the fair is told, brief letterpress descriptions explaining each splendid illustration, and the views grouped for most convenient reference. The volume here presented is the gathering together of the great harvest of beauties and marvels the fair afforded. Let's review this briefly. This first sentence is wildly interesting to me, as we have an indication that there are more or less credible publications giving views of this event. We don't get a specific book, only that there are numerous giving less credible information. Should we believe that just because this is 1893, that in the highest echelons of companies, governments, and organizations, everyone played by the rules, nice and fair? Would this not be an interesting show, actually? Similar to Mad Men, in a sense, only in the late 19th century. The year is 1890. Advertising companies, book publishers, and government agencies all vying for imagery prowess, sourcing and capturing high-profile artists, flipping said artists and retouchers, covert operations to steal original negatives, manipulating the pictorial aspects of events to suit their collective aspirations. Maybe that's too nerdy. Sounds good to me, anyways. Back on track. There are a few more points to bring forward. The first is the use of the word photographic. We have seen numerous publications use the word photographic. Have they been completely truthful? Next, it is stated that there are brief letterpress descriptions for each splendid illustration. Again, the use of the term illustration, almost implying that these images are illustrations. Now let's make something crystal clear. The word illustrate has multiple meanings, and can mean to make something clear or intelligible by examples or analogies. Much of these presentations that I am giving are demonstrations or illustrating various ideas and concepts. Technically, I am currently in the midst of illustrating the idea of contrast with an upcoming image from this publication. It is always possible that these words could be used both ways. This is where discernment is paramount in deciphering whether it is meant a particular way. Or could it be written specifically this way in order to represent both meanings, as a way to initially deflect inquiry by stating these scenes are merely illustrating, by example, through imagery, what has happened in the past, while simultaneously being truthful in the sense that these images may be photographic in nature, but have been altered with illustrative elements. Then once they are put under intense inspection and scrutiny, then it's almost a form of plausible deniability. Well, of course there are illustrated elements, or these images are illustrated. That was stated in the preface. We told you that. Something to chew on there. Let's get back to our image. Alright, as we go through some details of this image, try to pick out the contrasting detail that is related to the previous example. This image is a representation of the electric fountains opposite the southeast corner of the electricity building, the building that we saw under construction in the previous image. Let's begin with the fountain itself. We don't have a medium, but we do have a signature in the bottom right corner. I do believe this is a photograph and will explain why as we examine it further. Starting with the fountain, upon closer inspection you can visibly see that our retoucher was making it rain. literally with white ink or marker all throughout the water in this fountain. Take notice of the large streams of water in the center that have highlights applied in a vertical fashion, up and down along with the water itself, while the smaller water features around the outside all have brush strokes that range from horizontal to diagonal, then to vertical. Look at this spout in the center. You can visibly see the individual brush strokes here. Even the base has a highlight applied to it. Finally, you may even see on the taller water streams on top of the white markings are thin, dark strokes that look to be applied to potentially give some dimension or depth to the water. In my opinion, this did not work at all, and only drew more attention to the clearly illustrated water elements. Next, we take a closer look at this electricity building. Please draw your attention to the closest corner of the building, just past these illustrated lampposts. Looking at the shadows and varying tones of the interior section along with the windows running off to the left of the image, there is a clear distinction of depth with the shadows, or with the contrast of areas blocked by the sunlight. Now begin to draw your eye from left to right, down the length of the building. Begin to notice that the contrast we saw earlier is practically non-existent within the shaded areas of this building. This shadow is the same color as this, is the same color as this, is the same tone as the flags, is the same contrast on the molding, which is the same outline color on the ornamentation, which is why? Because this is mostly, if not all, illustrated over. The only element creating depth in this part of the image is the perspective of the building, yet the areas of shadow are all consistent, which should not be the case. Briefly looking back to our first corner, look how this section is clearly much darker than, say, this section, almost right beside it. The contrasting elements are different due to the various angles of architecture creating shadows. Do you see that kind of variation in the remaining sections of this building? Looking down at this structure behind the electrical building, we can see many of the same inconsistent shadowing, or consistent shadowing, I should say, mainly on the obelisks running along the top of the building. Take notice of the outlines, the absolutely inconsistent shape of almost every one. Even this one that has a stroke all the way around it. Now we get to our final example. Maybe you spotted it while we discuss these other details. Draw your attention to the pillars in the far right of the image. Notice how the sections of the sky in between the pillars are a different color than the skyline above. They are darker. They are a different tone. These are the kind of details that we need to be looking for when deciphering historical imagery. This detail now brings forth my reasoning for believing this is indeed a photograph that has been heavily illustrated. As we discussed in the previous example, it is possible that there were sections of photographs that our retouchers did not attempt to slice out. These sections in between the pillars are just that. They are the original color or tone of the skyline, along with the much darker shadows that run along these pillars. Look through each of these sections and compare these varying shadows to the illustrated portions of the electricity building. There is more contrasting degrees within those pillars than large sections of that building. It appears that, however this image was taken, the white areas have been completely blown out, and some elements had to be drawn in to complete the image. Or it could be something else, which hopefully will be discussed in another video, which is quality in general. Is this the result of simply taking a terrible photo? This is possible, yet improbable, considering the scale and budget of this event. It would be expected that the imagery of these buildings would be the best photographs of the 19th century. Another possibility is that these images could be copies from original negatives. My knowledge and experience in this is quite limited, yet could it be possible that the diminishing quality of some of these images is due to the duplicating of copies, not originals? Does copying a negative over and over reduce the quality? Does it damage the original? I simply do not know. Maybe someone who has more knowledge of this could comment below. It is only a selection of thoughts to ponder for yourself. So photography has become an additional data check to improve preservation and validity of historical events. However, the ability to retouch or edit these images seemingly runs parallel with the inception of photography itself. I'm unsure if there are other creators taking this approach to historical imagery. It is an incredibly deep aspect of historical documentation, and one that should absolutely be discussed. Now, this does not mean wildly unchecked skepticism. This is no statement of it's all fanciful fiction. Everything is edited. This has dichotomy, black and white, light and dark, positive and negative. It also includes degrees, ranging in between. It is those intermediary steps between the opposites that are being explored here, along with various details or basic art examples, so that you can replicate this with your research, or even reviewing pictures on other videos. This is an attempt to present these findings while giving you, watching, the tools to identify these types of anomalies for yourself, if you choose to test them, all the while trying to present that spectrum as objectively as possible, and maybe including some dry humor along the way. As this presentation comes to a close, I would like to leave you with a section from a book titled World's Columbian Exposition, Chicago, from 1901. It is in the introduction on page 8 and will be linked below. Since we are discussing the initial stages of development for this event, it felt like an interesting section to end on. It reads as follows. The work accomplished in this period of gigantic and harmonious effort included also all the complicated underground work necessary in the connection of electric lighting and power cables, in the distribution of gas and water, and in the installation of a complete and perfect sewage system. All the grading and construction work involved in the establishment of basin, canals, terraces, balustrades, bridges, landing stairs, vases, fountains, monumental columns, and groups of statuary, all the ornamental landscape work and gardening necessary to bring the artificial lagoon and its islands into harmony with the general architectural scheme. The artificial and natural landscape and waterwork of Jackson Park was not merely accessory to the great buildings which occupied the higher plateaus established for them, but an essential part of the design as a whole. Buildings and grounds were developed together and in closest sympathy. They can hardly be judged apart. In a few short months, art and energy created on a sandy waste on the margin of Lake Michigan a city of monumental architecture such as no emperor or king of ancient or modern times ever dreamed of. With that, I would like to thank you for your time, and hopefully this was enjoyable, entertaining, and informative. If you gained any value from this, give the video a like. Let me know your thoughts below in the comments. And if you're interested in learning more about the manipulation of historical documents, consider subscribing and learning about it with me.